In this video I continue to look at Python namespaces, but on this occasion it is with an emphasis on local scope. Let's consider this computer program. You can see here we have a function that doesn't really do much of any interest. It's just a demonstration for the purposes of this video, and we have this region of the code which we can see here calls upon the function above. Now if I consider this computer program, I will know that there will be a namespace for this function and there will be a namespace for this area of the code. As per the previous videos in this short series on Python namespaces, I am going to look at the namespaces schematically. And here you can see the namespace for this area of the computer program, and here you can see the namespace for this area, i.e. the function. Now if you consider this area of the computer program, you can see that this line x is assigned 1, and that is represented in the schematic diagram here, where x is the name that's bound to the integer object that has the value of 1, and this line is responsible for this entry in the dictionary, and we can see that we have the identifier of y, the name of y, identifying this integer object that has the value of 2, as is reflected here where we assign to the y 2. And of course the namespace for this area of the computer program will also have this here, which is the name of the function, and the name is bound to this, which is the function in its object form, because remember, everything in Python is regarded as being an object. Now this namespace is the namespace for the function, and if we look at this program statement, x is assigned the string hello, we can see the entry for that in the namespace is here, where x is the name bound to the string object that contains the value of hello. This program statement gives us this entry in the namespace, and we can see the name is y, and that the object is an instance of the string class that has the value of world. Now we can see that the program has two values of x and two values of y, and as a human we may get confused by that, but Python does not, because it keeps a separate namespace for this area of the code shown here and for this area of the code shown here. So we can see that this x is bound to this instance and this x is bound to this instance. So we have this ability to separate code so we can use the same variable names without there being a risk of conflict. And of course, I've mentioned before, for software engineering purposes, you don't usually go about naming variables with the same name, but I'm just using this demonstration program here to point out the purpose of namespaces in Python, so we don't have conflicts, which we will see is important when we move on to look at other aspects of coding in Python. So let's consider the runtime for this computer program, which you can see here, and let's single step through our code. Well, we know this line is going to execute first, and we know this line is going to execute, and that will set up this area within the namespace. And on this line, what we're going to do, we're going to print the x and the y, and of course that's going to be printing these out to the screen, because the x and the y that appear here are referring to this x and y name. So when we look to the runtime, we can see we have the 1 and the 2, which we can clearly see here are the values of these objects. We then execute this line, and what this is going to do, it's going to show us the namespace for this area of the code. In other words, it's going to show us this namespace here, which we can see on these two lines. And of course, there's things in there which do not appear in my code, but they're put there by Python. But the things I'm particularly interested in to reflect upon the schematic diagrams I've produced are these here. We can see this is the name of the function, and this is the variable x and the variable y. In other words, the names x, y, which appear here in the namespace for this area of the code. This is then the next program statement to execute, and this is a call to this function. And of course what this line will do, it'll produce this entry in the different namespace, and this line will produce this entry in the different namespace, and we can see that this x is bound to this object, which is an instance of the string class that has the value of hello, and this name here, the y, is bound to this instance of the string class that has the value world. Then of course we come on to this line here, and what it will do, it'll print the X and the Y. And of course on this occasion the X and the Y that's going to be printed is governed by these names, which means we're going to go to these objects, to their value, and print them to the screen. So when we come here we can see that we do in fact have the hello and the world printed out. Of course the next program statement to execute is this, which is going to give us the namespace for this function, and the namespace schematically is shown here, so we should see the names X and Y printed to the console, and you can see here that's precisely what we do have. We have the X and the Y being printed. Let's consider this computer program again, and we know for this program we're going to have a local namespace, and this will be the namespace for this function, and we also know for this area of the code we're going to have another namespace. Now the namespace for the function that will appear in the local namespace is as shown here, and you can see we have two names X and Y, and they are bound to the appropriate string objects, and we can see we have the value of hello and world respectively in those instances of the string class. Now of course for this area of the code we're going to have this namespace, and if we look to the dictionary residing within this namespace it will look like the following, and we can see we have the X and Y names which appear here in the code, and we also have the name of the function appearing here, and these are the objects associated with those names which I've covered already. So if we quickly look at the runtime again for this computer program, which we've already considered in this video, we can see the runtime here, and the bit I'm interested in is if you look at this line where we're going to print the namespace for this function, you can see it is here, and these are the names that appear in the namespace as you can see here. So when we consider this function, we can see it has a local namespace. In other words, the X and the Y that appear here in this function are belonging to this function only. They are local to that function, which goes on to mean that this area of the code does not know of the existence of these X and Y's. So this area of the program will in fact not be able to see this local namespace. However, if I was to remove these two lines from the function, what would happen? Well, let's have a look at that on the next slide. Well, if you now consider this computer program and look at the function, you can see indeed that from this area I've removed the X and the Y, where the X was assigned hello and the Y was assigned world. Before I consider namespaces, let's just remind ourselves as to how variables come into existence in Python, how we get instances of classes in Python. Well, we can look at this line, and what this is doing, to X we assign 1, so X becomes the variable. The full description of this is X is the name that is bound to an instance of the integer class that has the value of 1. But for a variable to exist, we have to use an appropriate name, and we have to assign something to it. If I go to this line where you can see I'm printing the X as well as also the Y, what's happening here, we're using a variable that's already been introduced on this line, and of course this line is producing another variable. So in Python you both declare the variable and assign it at the same time. Now this isn't the same in all programming languages. In other programming languages you will declare a variable, you will ask for a variable to come into existence, and at some later point you assign something to that variable. But in Python it's effectively done like this. This will create and assign to the variable. That being said, now let's turn our attention to the namespaces for this computer program. And what we will expect to see is, because we have a function and this area of the code, we will expect to see two namespaces. So it's reasonable for us to assume that we're going to have a local namespace for the function, and we're going to have another namespace for this area of the code. If I look at this area of the code and look to its namespace, what we're going to see in there is the following. we're going to see a dictionary that has the names here, and these names will be bound to the appropriate instances of classes, as you can see here. Now, if we consider the function, you can see on this line we're asking to print x and y, but that's working on the assumption that the x and the y already exist. And if you study this code, you can see that I have nothing similar to what I've had here in the other area of the program. In this area, there is no creation and assignment to a variable. There is no creation of an instance of any class. What this is doing, it's asking to print x and y, and this is going to print whatever the namespace is for this function. And because within this function there is in effect no objects being created, it's reasonable for us to assume that there isn't going to be a local namespace. So let's consider the runtime for this computer program and see in fact what Python will do under the circumstances that I've just described. Here we can see the runtime, and if we go through it single step, we can see that this will execute first, this will then execute, and that will create these two names bound to their appropriate instances of the integer class. And what this line will do, it'll print the values of x and y that appear in this namespace, namely the 1 and the 2. And if we look to the runtime, we can see that's precisely what happens. If we now come to this line, we can see that that's going to print the namespace. And if we look to the runtime, we can see indeed it does print the namespace. And there's all those other names that I've discussed in the previous videos. But here we can see that we have the namespace names for the bits I've been responsible for coding into the program. And then when I go here, what we're going to see happen is a call to this function. And what this function will do is print x and y. Well, let's have a look at what the output is. It prints the 1 and the 2. So it's in fact gone and printed what's in this namespace. Why is it gone there? Well, because there's nothing in the local namespace that it can refer to. And what happens with the function will look to its own namespace. If one effectively doesn't exist, as in this example, it then goes and has a look at the namespace for this area of the code, namely this, and it can see that the x and the y have these values within the objects. So look here, it prints the x and the y values, the 1 and the 2. And of course what this will then do, it'll print the namespace for this function. Now let's remind ourselves of the namespace, the local namespace. There's nothing in it. So what in fact Python will do is output this. It'll say, I've got an empty namespace. You can see it still has the opening and closing square brackets, but there's nothing in between them. So just to conclude that little bit of the explanation, when we're on this line here, we're attempting to print the x and the y. And of course, the x and the y is not in the local namespace. So the function will say, well, I better go over here and have a look at this namespace. And it sees the x and the y has the value of 1 and 2, and that's what it outputs here. Now let's consider this computer program, and if you look at the function, you can see here I've put back the x and the y, where the x is assigned hello and the y is assigned world. But if you come to this area of the code, you can see I've removed the x and the y from here. And if you remember, x was assigned 1 and y was assigned 2, but they're no longer here in this part of the program. So if I now consider what the namespace is for this program, what we're going to get is a local namespace for the function, and we're going to get another namespace for this area of the program. Now, of course, we know that the local namespace is for the function, so if we have a look at the dictionary that will appear in the local namespace, it is as follows. And we can see that we have the names x and y because they appeared here, and we can see here we have instances of the string class containing the hello and the world because that's what appeared in the code over here. Now, if we come to this area and we have a look at this, there's no assigning to x, there's no assigning to y in this area. In other words, we're not declaring and assigning to a variable, and there's no variables appearing in this area. But what we do have in the namespace is, as you can see here, we have the name of the function, and then we have the object, because if you remember, everything in Python is an object. So let's look at the runtime for this computer program, and you can see it is here. And if we single step through the program and reflect upon the runtime, we know we're going to start here, and this will cause a call to this function. So these two lines will execute and set up this local namespaces dictionary, where you can see the X is bound to the hello and the Y is bound to the world, and this line is going to print the X and the Y, and of course you can see it prints hello world. This line will then print the dictionary that's in the local namespace, and you can see that is here, and it prints the name X and the name Y, which it's taken from here in the dictionary, because this here defines the local namespace for this function. Of course, we then return from executing the code inside the function to execute this line, and it displays this, and this is the namespace for this area of the computer program. And if you look, what we're actually printing is this namespace. And of course, if we look here, we can see all the names that Python puts in, but look here and you can see that this is the name of the function that appears here in this dictionary. Then this line executes, and we can see it results in this error. And if we come down here, it tells us what the error is. It says name X is not defined. And if we look to the statement, we can see it's attempting to print X and it's attempting to print Y. And of course, Y isn't defined either. But we always find that when we get an error, it will always tell us the first error. And that's what we're seeing here. Now, the reason it is giving us this error is because if we look at the namespace for this region of the code, and we look at the dictionary, we can see the only thing in the dictionary is this. So when we come to this line, it doesn't know about X and Y because it's not in its namespace. Now you may be asking, well, why doesn't it go here and print this X and Y and print hello world? Well, that's a reasonable question, except it doesn't. What you find is when you are here and you are using this namespace, this area of the code cannot see anything that appears within this function, because this area shown in the schematic diagram is for this area of the code only. So this area of the code, as defined by this namespace, has no idea as to the existence of this namespace. So as far as this area of the program is concerned, these are not in its scope. And also, if we reflect upon the fact that this namespace here only exists for the duration that this code is running, in other words, it's only there for the execution time of this code, where it is created upon entry into this function and then is got rid of when you finish executing this function, and that's called its lifetime. It doesn't exist when we get to here. So there are two reasons why, in fact, we cannot get on the X and Y. For this video, I'm stressing the local namespace nature of this function, and the local namespace keeps these variables to themselves. So this function is the only thing that can see this X and the Y in this computer program. Check out the supporting website for these videos. In addition, why not follow me on Twitter, as I issue a tweet every time I upload a new video.